The Peterson family Christmas was an exercise in theatrical consumption, a tree costing more than most people's monthly rent, and a suffocating certainty that they knew what was best for everyone, especially me. I sat in the corner, in my simple sweater and jeans, watching Jessica flaunt her new Mercedes key while her husband Tyler boasted about his latest tech acquisition. At 36, I'd learned to occupy space quietly, present but professionally unremarkable. Madison, my mother, Jennifer, barked from across the room, summoning me like a servant. More wine. The good Bordeaux. Not that cheap California swill. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world drift by, I'm struck by how little we truly know about the people closest to us. Where are you joining me from today, and what are you sipping on? I always look forward to your stories in the comments. But back to that Christmas dinner, and the news my father was so eager to share. I stood up without a word. Decisiveness had always been my strongest asset, though in this house, they mistook my silence for submission. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the hand-scraped hardwood that probably cost more than my first apartment. I could hear them behind me, their voices a synchronized choir of self-importance. Jessica's laugh was sharp, like breaking glass. She was murmuring something to Tyler about my vague little consulting gig and how it was a shame I couldn't afford a real car. In the kitchen, I pulled the heavy bottle of Bordeaux from the cellar rack. Through the window, I watched the moonlight catch the hood of my 8-year-old Volvo. It was parked on the street, relegated to the curb to make room for my father's Ferrari and my sister's Mercedes. To them, that car was a balance sheet of my failures. To me, it was a ghost, the perfect operational cover that allowed me to move through D.C. without a security detail when I needed to be invisible. I returned to the living room and poured the wine with a hand that didn't shake. I was the silent investor in their version of family, footing the emotional bill while they spent my dignity like loose change. My mother took the glass without looking at me. My father, Jason, was standing by the fireplace. At 67, he still carried himself like he was in a boardroom, ready to liquidate a competitor. He cleared his throat, and the room went silent. It was time for a presentation. Your mother and I have made an executive decision regarding your property situation, Jason announced. He didn't ask, he didn't consult, he delivered a verdict. Something cold and clinical settled in my stomach. I took a seat, nursing a cup of grocery store coffee that I'd made myself. My property situation? I asked softly. That Arlington estate, Jennifer said, waving her hand as if she were shooing a fly. The one you never use. It's been sitting there for 3 years, Madison, just accumulating dust and wasting equity. It's stagnant, it's inefficient. It's not empty, I replied, my voice level. I use it every time I'm in the Capitol. You're never in the Capitol, Jessica interjected, leaning back in her designer chair. You're always traveling for work, if we can call it that, doing whatever it is consultants do in third world countries. That house sits vacant 340 days a year. It's an embarrassment to the family portfolio. We sold it, Jason said, his voice booming with pride. Got an excellent price, too. $5,200,000. Well above market value. The buyer wanted a quick close, so we handled the logistics. The room seemed to tilt. They hadn't just crossed a boundary, they had demolished it. I looked at the coffee in my hand. You sold my house without asking me. Madison, don't be so dramatic, Jason sighed, checking his watch. You signed that limited power of attorney 2 years ago, so I could manage the property taxes and maintenance while you were off consulting in those remote countries. I simply used it to sign off on a deal that was too good to pass up. After closing costs and our management fee 25%, which is standard for our expertise, you'll net about $3,900,000. We'll have a check for you by New Year's. A management fee, I repeated. The word felt metallic in my mouth. We did all the work, Madison, Jennifer explained, speaking to me as if I were a child who didn't understand the concept of a piggy bank. We found the buyer, structured the limited liability company, and handled the closing. In the real world, people get paid for their expertise. You should be thanking us. We turned a stagnant asset into liquid capital. This was the trap of normalizing cruelty. In their elitist world, I wasn't a person with rights or a career. I was an underperforming asset. Because I didn't flaunt my wealth, they assumed I didn't have any. Because I was useful and quiet, they dehumanized me into a line item they could trade. They didn't see a daughter, they saw a loophole. I didn't scream. I didn't ask why. I just set my cup down carefully and watched the steam rise from my cheap coffee. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, not trying to summon regret, but seeking clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and they had just entered a debt they could never repay. Across the room, Jason was already on his tablet, his eyes gleaming as he calculated the $1,300,000 management fee they were siphoning off my life. He looked so smug, so certain of his own brilliance, unaware that he was counting a fortune that had just become a federal liability. I watched them toast with the Bordeaux I had just poured, and in my head, their laughter began to sound like a digital clock counting down. This was the silent regret of the watcher, the tragedy of their blindness. For years, I had stood on the perimeter of their lives, holding up the walls while they mocked the foundation. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, providing a compassion they had overdrafted for decades. They thought they were the titans of industry, the elitist guardians of the Peterson name, but they were actually living on a subscription that I had been footing the bill for. In 2022, when Jason's firm was bleeding out during the market crunch, it wasn't Jessica's brand icons or Jennifer's social status that stopped the hemorrhage. It was an anonymous bridge loan from a private trust, my trust. When Jessica needed that venue deposit for her over-the-top wedding, the one she flaunted in my face, the funds appeared without a name attached. I had spent 4 years trying to protect them, keeping my world a secret, not because I was ashamed, but because my position required a distance that kept them safe. Listing them as administrative trustees on the Arlington Estates Family Trust had been a gesture of trust, a safety net I gave them in case my work in high-level intelligence ever went dark. Now, that trust was a stagnant asset they had decided to liquidate. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over an app that didn't have an icon, a direct link to the secure federal terminal. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for permission. At exactly 12:03 a.m., I initiated the secrecy protocol. The screen glowed with a cold, blue light, a different kind of sunrise, made of facts and numbers. I logged the unauthorized breach of a federal asset. I flagged the transaction as a compromise of a classified intelligence hub. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, a silent execution of judgment. My father looked up from his tablet, catching my eye. He gave me a condescending nod, as if he were proud of me for finally accepting my place in his world. I didn't smile back. I just looked at him with the clinical detachment of an auditor closing an account. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were just comfortable in the belief that I was too weak to ever stop playing along. But tonight, the subscription was canceled. The next few hours were a masterclass in public relations, disguised as maternal concern. I didn't engage with them further at the table, and they took my silence as a white flag. By the time I reached my P-Day, a secure, high-end operational apartment I kept for my time in the city, my phone was already vibrating with the first wave of the social media tribunal. My mother, Jennifer, had posted a family update on Facebook, a carefully staged photo of the Christmas tree with an empty seat in the foreground. Her caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation, claiming that some people forget who raised them, and praying for clarity and maturity. The comments section was already filling with sympathy from her social circle, branding me as the ungrateful villain in her performance. They didn't see a daughter being robbed of $5,200,000. They saw a saintly mother being burdened by an ungrateful child. This was the villain's escalation, a strategic strike intended to isolate me before the legal reality set in. Then came the group text. Jessica led the charge, her messages arriving in rapid-fire bursts of arrogance. She told me I was overreacting and that it was just a house I never used. She said I should be grateful our father got me over $2 million. Tyler added his 2 cents, his tone dripping with the same condescension he used to discuss failing startups, calling my behavior childish, and demanding an apology for the mess I had created for my parents. I sat at my desk, the glow of the screen illuminating the spreadsheet I was building. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I screenshotted every message, every post, every public lie. To them, this was a family spat. To me, it was data entry. Every insult was a ledger entry of their intent. They were doubling down on the narrative of my incompetence to justify their greed and the theft of $1,300,000. They needed me to be a failure, because if I was successful, then they were criminals. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. I watched them build their tribunal on a foundation of sand, unaware that the tide was already coming in. There was no sadness left in me, only the cold precision of an auditor. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. Inside my laptop, the screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and the imminent arrival of federal oversight. I ignored the vibrations of my family's frantic group chat. The screen was a strobe light of toxicity, but my eyes were fixed on the black screen of my encrypted terminal. I had spent 4 years maintaining a low profile in Washington when I was in town, staying in my designated residence in Arlington, the one my family thought was just an empty house I never used. The transition from personal drama to professional reality was instantaneous. This was the professional escalation where the conflict shifted from a boardroom presentation to a national security incident. My secure line vibrated with a unique, rhythmic hum. I answered on the first pulse. Director Morrison's voice was crisp, lacking any trace of the festive season. He informed me that the unauthorized transaction involving the Arlington estate had been flagged by the monitoring system. I confirmed that I had just been notified of the sale by the trustees during a holiday gathering. Morrison's silence on the other end was heavy with the weight of federal statutes. He reminded me of what my parents had conveniently ignored, that property was a registered, federal sensitive compartmented information facility, or a SCIF. It was part of my security protocol as the Undersecretary of Intelligence, a secure hub designed for the handling of classified data. It was protected under the Defense Production Act and registered with the Department of State. Legally speaking, that house was an extension of federal property. By selling it to a private investment group for $5,200,000, my parents hadn't just overstepped. They had facilitated a national security breach. Director Morrison explained that the sale was automatically void under federal law, but the act of the sale itself was a criminal violation. The Diplomatic Security Service and federal agents were being mobilized immediately. This wasn't about a house anymore. It was about the unauthorized transfer of a secured federal asset. Morrison told me that agents were already en route to my parents' Manhattan penthouse to secure the trustees and seize all documentation related to the transaction. I ended the call and looked at the reflection in my darkened window. My family had spent years dismissing my career, mocking my car, and assuming I was too incompetent to manage my own life. They had acted on those assumptions and sold my home because they thought I was a worthless burden who wouldn't fight back. They had no idea that, while they were busy playing the elite, I was the one holding the keys to a world they weren't even cleared to know exists. I felt a surge of cold control. This wasn't an act of revenge, it was the inevitable logic of the secrecy protocol. They had triggered a mechanism they couldn't stop, and now the federal government was coming to collect the debt. Director Morrison's voice came through the encrypted speaker again. It was the kill shot, the kind of revelation that changes a story from a family drama into a national tragedy. He told me, the intelligence audit on Meridian Property Holdings Limited Liability Company was complete. My father had called them smart investors during dinner. He had praised their speed and their all-cash offer, telling me that's how capitalism works. He didn't see the red flags because he was blinded by the green of his $1,300,000 management fee. But Morrison's report was factual and lethal. Meridian wasn't a group of property flippers. They were a sophisticated shell company linked directly to a foreign energy cartel. By executing that sale, my parents hadn't just committed real estate fraud or violated the Foreign Missions Act. They had unintentionally facilitated an act of corporate espionage. They had handed the keys of a registered federal security hub over to a foreign adversary. The air in my small apartment felt suddenly heavy, smelling of ozone and old coffee. I stared at the screen, watching the flowcharts Morrison had sent the tangled web of offshore accounts that led from the cartel back to the company my father had helped structure. My father, the construction mogul, and my mother, the socialite, were now primary subjects in a federal espionage investigation. The $1,300,000 they were counting so smugly was no longer just stolen money. It was now officially proceeds from a crime against the state. This was the criminal twist that stripped away any remaining path to redemption. They hadn't just been greedy, they had been dangerous. Their elitist assumption that I was too incompetent to manage my own life had led them to compromise national security for a 25% cut. I looked at a framed photo on my desk, the Peterson family at a summer gala, everyone smiling and perfect. I realized I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel the urge to call them and warn them. I felt the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a self-destruct sequence. They had built their world on the belief that they were the masters of reality, but reality was about to arrive in 3 black SUVs. The 9 a.m. reckoning didn't arrive with a shout. It arrived with the rhythmic crunch of tires and the low, heavy hum of 3 black SUVs pulling up to the private entrance of our Manhattan penthouse. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the men and women in dark suits stepped out their badges, catching the morning light with a cold, metallic glint. Inside, Jason and Jennifer were still in their silk robes, nursing the remnants of their Christmas ego. They looked out at the driveway, confusion morphing into a sharp, jagged fear. "Madison, what is this?" Jennifer shrieked, her voice reaching that frantic pitch she used when the help was late. "There are people on the lawn. Call your office. Fix this with your little government job, immediately." I didn't move. I didn't even look at her. I just finished my coffee. The front door didn't just open, it was bypassed. Special Agent Walsh entered the living room with the kind of authority that makes old money feel like counterfeit currency. Jason tried to stand, tried to summon the boardroom persona he had used to intimidate me for 3 decades. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is a private residence." Agent Walsh didn't even blink. She didn't look at Jason. She looked directly at me and gave a sharp, professional nod. "Ma'am, Undersecretary Madison, the perimeter is secure. We have the warrants for the seizure of all electronic devices and bank records associated with the unauthorized sale of the Arlington SCIF. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a legacy evaporating. Jason's arm dropped to his side. Jennifer's glass of imported orange juice slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble. They looked at me, then at the agents, then back at me. To them, I was the failing freelancer, the unremarkable middle daughter who drove an 8-year-old Volvo. But the reality was staring them in the face, wearing a federal badge. "Undersecretary?" Jessica whispered from the stairs, her designer robe suddenly looking like a costume. "Madison, please," Jason said, his voice cracking, his arrogance replaced by a pathetic, naked begging. "We didn't know. It was a mistake. We'll give the money back. Tell them it's fine. Tell them we're family." I stood up and walked toward him. I felt the clinical weight of 4 years of secrecy and 30 years of being dismissed. "Family doesn't sell your home without asking. Jason," I said, my voice calm and factual. "Family doesn't take a $1,300,000 management fee from your life. You violated federal law because you assumed you knew more about my world than I did." You acted on a fantasy where I was the weak link in your portfolio. Now, I'm choosing reality over your fantasy. The power flip was absolute. As the agents escorted them toward the SUVs for questioning, I watched them realize that their status, their corporate boards, and their social standing were just stagnant assets in a world of national security protocols. This was seed sowers' justice. By allowing the investigation to proceed, I wasn't just punishing them. I was setting a precedent that protected the integrity of our intelligence hubs. I was building a future where my work and my worth could never be traded like a commodity again. 6 months later, the dust had settled into a permanent distance. My parents were on 2 years of probation, their professional licenses flagged, and their reputations in the Hamptons were non-existent. Jessica and Tyler were cut off from the family wealth that had been seized to pay federal penalties. I didn't celebrate their fall. Accounting doesn't require joy, it just requires a balance. I was appointed as the ambassador to a G7 nation shortly after the investigation closed. Standing on the balcony of my new residence, looking out over a city where my work actually mattered, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with their approval. I've come to realize that so many of us spend our lives waiting for our family to see our value, to recognize the brilliance we carry in the shadows. But your worth is not a stagnant asset for others to trade. It is not a subscription they can cancel or a line item they can liquidate. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's just the only way to set yourself free from the debt of their expectations. You don't need their permission to be luminous. You just need the courage to stop playing a role in a story that was designed to keep you small. Sovereignty of the soul is the only success that lasts. If you've learned that your worth isn't for sale, share this with someone who needs to stand tall today. Subscribe for more stories of justice.